In December of 1981, almost 2 years after Steven Stayner escaped Kenneth Parnell and 9 years since he was first kidnapped, the trial for his kidnapping would begin in Hayward, California. What would seem like an open and shut case with plenty of evidence would be anything but. Kenneth Parnell's defense would be that Steven had chosen to stay with him, and a trial meant to determine Parnell's guilt or innocence would be turned around and used as a way to judge the victim. Join us in this episode of California True Crime, The Life and Kidnapping of Steven Stayner, the second trial. Welcome to California True Crime. This is Jessica, and with me are Sean and Charles. How are you guys?
I'm good.
Doing good.
Good. Before we get started, I think, Charles, you had an update?
Yeah, before we get going on the second trial, we would like to take a little bit of time to thank one of our Patreon supporters, and this is somebody who supports us at the $5 level. We'd really like to thank Kimmy for all her support and good wishes, her retweets, and just everything she does to support the show. In fact, we were lucky enough to actually meet her at our first California True Crime meetup, which Kimmy actually organized, and we had a blast and can't wait to do it again.
Yeah, we got to meet her and another of our followers, Andy. We had a really good time, and they were really supportive, which helped us out a lot.
Yes.
We're moving towards the end of our series on the life and kidnapping of Steven Stayner. Last episode, we went over the trial for the kidnapping of Timothy White. It had a few twists and turns that were a bit unexpected. This episode, we'll be covering the trial for the kidnapping of Steven Stayner. It will be a very frustrating episode because so much of the defense that Parnell will rely on is victim blaming. But it's important to talk about, not just because it affects Steven and the Stayner family, but because this is a common thing you hear about in other trials, and too many people are affected by it and may even decide to not come forward because of encountering it. The information for this episode came from all sorts of sources. All California newspapers are kind of covering this trial, many of the same ones we've said before. The San Francisco Examiner in particular starts covering it from day to day, so I use that a lot, just because the trial takes place in Hayward, so in the Bay Area. And just something of note, when I first started researching this story, because I've only really used newspapers, so in 1972, when Steven goes missing, it's in December. And so there were all these stories about him not coming home and people looking for him. And they're right next to stories about Christmas and advertisements about all the things you can buy. And then in 1981, when this is going on, the trial starts as well in December. So it was weird to see more Steven Stayner stories next to Christmas ads and family things, and just kind of full circle.
It is interesting looking at those old newspapers and seeing all those old ads and stuff like that. This was before kind of our time, but still, it's pretty interesting looking at all those stuff.
When we left off last episode, Kenneth Parnell had just been found guilty of kidnapping Timothy White. He was sentenced to the maximum the law allows, which was 7 years. The next trial for the charges in Steven's kidnapping against Parnell will also be held in Hayward Superior Court, and the same judge will be there. So M.O. Sabra will also be the judge in this case. And right after Sabra passes down his judgment of 7 years in the kidnapping of Timothy White, things get moving in this new trial just right away.
Was there ever any thought of having it in Merced, or did they move it for primarily the same reasons that they moved Timothy's?
Yeah, after the preliminary hearing in Merced, the lawyer there, Ellery, he wants to move it just right away for the exact same reasons. And I think it might have been part of the same, because I remember when I was researching it, they were talking about it at the same time they were talking about moving it for the Timothy White trial. And when this really started, it was meant to be Steven's trial that was first.
Oh, okay.
So they kind of set that up.
Logistically, you have everything already set up. Might as well do one.
And you have a huge jury pool.
Right.
On December 1st, 1981, jury selection begins. And picking a jury in Alameda County is a little more difficult this time around because the last trial there was a lot of media coverage, and they think probably more people have heard about it. Each lawyer takes their time asking jurors questions. It seems lots of the possible jurors they interview do know and have heard now about the case. And this isn't really disqualifying because it's more of, can the person still decide based on the law, even though they've read something or heard something? And actually, if you want I'll put it up on our social media. There's a really great episode of a podcast called Getting Off, where two defense attorneys talk about picking a jury. Like in the last case, each defendant's lawyer is given 10 challenges, but there are 10 more because of Murphy's lawyers. So both Parnell and Murphy will be tried together, and they each have lawyers. Murphy's lawyers are Neil Morse and Wayne Eisenhart, and Parnell's attorney is named Jack Ellery. On December 9th, 1981, after 60-plus jurors are dismissed for varying reasons, a jury of 6 men and 6 women are sworn in. By the time trial starts, the main charge against Parnell and Murphy are conspiracy to kidnap, and both men plead not guilty. So conspiracy to kidnap in California is something called a complicated crime. And in this case, when people are planning the crime, it gets added to the actual charge. So Murphy and Parnell kidnap Steven, but they work together to do it. So you add conspiracy to the crime of kidnapping. And then it's basically you follow the kidnapping law. That's where they'll get the number of years that the judge will use if they're found guilty, that sort of thing. And the purpose is because in this case, they want to be able to charge both Parnell and Murphy with the big crime of kidnapping. But this is more complicated because they did it together. Technically, Murphy is the person who lures Steven into the car, and his part in the kidnapping ends quickly, and Parnell keeps him for much longer. They have to charge them both with the crime of working together to kidnap in order to charge them both with the crime of kidnapping.
That makes sense. So if you only said kidnapping on either, one of them didn't do as much, and it might be less of a case, and they might not get charged with it. By putting conspiracy on top of it, they work together. It's kind of handcuffed together in a way to keep the evidence together against them.
Right.
And based on their evidence they have, it sounds like it's a pretty good case of all of the little bits leading up to the kidnapping, rather than the kind of what we saw in Timothy's case of, was it kidnapping, wasn't it kidnapping?
That will still come up here, but the point is that you're adding it to sort of explain more fully what actually happened here. A kidnapping happened, but bigger than that, a conspiracy to kidnap occurred. So it doesn't sound like it changes it that much, but it changes their ability to charge them both and how they're going to handle the trial.
Do they charge Parnell with like false imprisonment or?
So false imprisonment is also something that the jury can decide on in this case, but they can't say that he's guilty of both. They're kind of like a stacked crime. So kidnapping is at the top. It's the more serious. But if the jury were to say, we don't think that's what happened here, we think it was a lesser crime, they could say false imprisonment. Okay. And Murphy's lawyers will make that argument.
So then for like a prosecution, I'm going to go for the brass ring and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. But as like you said, I'm a juror, I can scale it down. If the jury collectively says, well, we don't all think it's this, but they're instructed on here's what the gradients of that crime are.
They can't do both because it's either one or the other. They're different. They're on the similar heading of things that are similar,
which logically
but
sounds,
they are different things. So if you're saying this person is falsely imprisoned, you can't also say they were kidnapped. They're different crimes, and they want the more serious crime. And the other thing is, in general, we don't want a prosecutor to just be able to stack all sorts of crimes onto somebody. People would never ever get out of jail, and maybe that would be good in this instance. But you could do that in almost anything. Just start adding things. Or if you rob, then you could start adding charges for theft and all kinds of stuff.
But in this case, it seems like the two crimes are really different. It's kidnapping is the act of well, I guess it goes back to our conversation a couple of episodes ago about, is kidnapping a single event or is it the continuation of keeping the child away from their parents?
Right, and that will be still an issue in this trial. In court, Parnell looks much the same as he did in the White trial. He's lost a lot of weight, if you remember, and we'll make sure there are pictures of him up from during this time for you to see. Murphy, on the other hand, is having a very difficult time if you go by his appearance. And we get this description from the press, which is something that we wouldn't have otherwise. They're there, they can see what he looks like, and so they can tell us. When Murphy comes to court, he is visibly disheveled. and looks as if he hasn't showered in some time. The newspapers describe him as, quote, unkempt, poorly shaved, with his hair matted. The paper also describes him as barely taller than a child himself. He's 5'2", and he has deep-set, hurt eyes. And while in court, he can't really see because his glasses have broken, and the judge finds out that they've been broken for several months. The judge gets really angry at both how Murphy looks, as well as the fact that he has broken glasses, and he tells the sheriffs to get all these things fixed.
Is this all in the jail then? Is the judge like yelling at the sheriff's department and the jail?
Yeah, because they brought him into the court looking like this. And it's not, I don't think it's in front of a jury. I think the jury's out at the time, but yeah, he apparently looks pretty bad. Okay. And the judge doesn't want that to influence anyone's decision, as well as he needs to be treated a certain way.
Right.
Which makes sense because that's a kind of a negative mark against the sheriff's department and the entire court system in that case, because he's not getting his due process in a respectful manner.
And the judge is right on it, taking care of it. But it just is good also to have the press there, because if he hadn't been, that's the only way we would know that he's not being treated.
But that the tone and the quotes that you pulled are very telling too. It's already starting to spin that narrative of Murphy being the lesser of the two, the weaker partner.
Yeah, actually, from the time that he's arrested, and even in the last case with Sean Portman, despite the fact that there are some things that get leaked out that don't make us very happy, and probably not him either, the press actually really talks about both of them not as seriously as they do Parnell. And I don't mean seriously like they don't take it seriously what they did, but they talk about Sean Portman being a kid, and you can kind of get that from the articles. And they really also talk about Murphy. And I don't know Irvin Murphy, so I don't know how accurate it is, but they really talk about him not being quite as smart and not being with it. And they seem to feel for him. That comes through in the articles.
That he was somebody that maybe Parnell took advantage of.
They definitely don't go after him or Portman the same way they do Parnell. Before trial really gets off the ground, the judge has to deal with a few decisions. Two of the biggest are challenges by the defense. The first is that the defense would like the judge to disallow any testimony by psychiatrists or psychologists that Steven Stayner has talked with. The reasoning behind this has to do with the defense Parnell and his attorney planned to use during the trial, that Steven Stayner wasn't kidnapped, he went with Parnell willingly, had a good life, wanted to stay with him, and if any kidnapping happened, then it is past the statute of limitations. And you've probably heard about this because this was a defense they used to kind of get rid of charges. It went all the way to the First District Court of Appeals. That gets turned down and the charges are brought, but they can still use it as a defense in trial and hope a jury buys it. It will be up to a jury to decide whether this is a defense that holds any weight. And to counter this defense, which the prosecution has to do, because as we talked about before, there's often a tendency to believe adults over children. They're also concerned that the jury might have difficulty remembering that the young man who will testify, Steven Stayner, he looks really different than he did when he was first kidnapped.
Yeah, he's a 14, well, by this time, 15, almost 16-year-old kid. He's not the 7-year-old from the pictures.
And we'll probably talk about this a few times because it comes up quite a bit for the prosecution, because they're afraid they can't see the little kid who was taken and what a jury might change how they decide in this case.
Right.
The other thing is that unlike in the Timothy White case, this case will have a lot more difficult things to talk about. Specifically, the sexual abuse will come up and will be talked about in detail. And those are hard details to hear. And sometimes when people have to hear hard details, they can kind of check out or maybe not listen as intently. And so there's just this fear, especially when it's coming from an older child, he's still a child, that the jury might not listen as well. So the prosecution wants to put on the stand both a psychologist and a psychiatrist to explain to the jury about Steven Stayner's life and the reasons why he wouldn't have left Kenneth Parnell. Specifically to talk about the abuse and to explain how that would keep him from leaving. So despite the fact that molestation charges aren't one of the things that Parnell is accused of here, those are charges, if you remember, the Merced district attorney tried to bring, but they keep getting thrown out. They never stick. But despite that they won't be actual charges, the sexual abuse becomes an important factor in countering what Parnell's attorney will describe as a wonderful life.
But before you go on, just to remind people, the reason why that those charges weren't brought or get thrown out is because of the lack of physical evidence?
Yeah, they kept bringing them, and in particular during the preliminary hearing, Steven would testify about all of it, and ultimately the judge believed there wasn't enough information for those charges to go forward, and the District Court of Appeals agreed with him. Ellery, Parnell's attorney, will contend that no sexual abuse occurred. They'll keep this throughout the entire trial. He will also argue that force, as we talked about before, which is an important part of the kidnapping statute, is important here under the law, but not just the initial force used to take someone, but continued force, especially in a case like this. Essentially, if we're to believe that Steven Stayner was kidnapped using psychological force, then we also believe he was held using psychological force as well. Ellery believes that during the kidnapping, force eventually fell away, and when that did, the crime ended and the statute of limitations began. According to him, since psychological force ended years ago, the 3 years has since passed and the state can no longer bring charges against Parnell.
This will be an interesting discussion because there's been plenty of times that they could say that, he was going to school on his own. He never brought it up. And I'm not agreeing with it, but like we talked about in another episode, they bring up good arguments on both sides.
Right. It's similar to the other argument, but it's a little bit more sophisticated. And they will definitely go through with a fine-tooth comb Steven's life to prove that force didn't exist, or to try and prove that.
Well, it's already planting the seeds of dissent, because how do you prove when psychological force is already something that they're trying to deal with, proving that it was going on anyway. Mm-hmm. So how do you prove when it ends?
We'll go through all that.
Okay.
So according to the defense, testimony on behalf of a psychologist would be prejudicial. Ellery says he isn't making an argument based on Steven's state of mind. He's actually making it based on the law and time. The prosecution disagrees, and that you can't fully understand the reason Steven stayed with Parnell without looking at the psychological issues behind the kidnapping. The Merced District Attorney Halford says that Steven suffered trauma, a wound you can't see but similar to a stabbing. If this were a case, for instance, that had a stabbing, you wouldn't consider that wound separate from any of the other legal questions. And this is when something we discussed episodes ago, when we started talking about when the abuse first happened, becomes important, because they're going to try and explain the things that Steven went through and how it affected him. And having some specific dates is good to be able to tell the jury.
Dates for his abuse.
Right, for when it started, to just kind of tell that story. It's also important to know that this kind of testimony was not something that happened very often. This was 1980, and testimony by a psychiatrist or a psychologist, especially because he'll be testifying about the quote-unquote brainwashing, it's just not a common occurrence. In fact, when the judge agrees to let the testimony go forward, he says, quote, "The rules of evidence do not preclude innovation." He also alluded that allowing the testimony would be breaking new ground in psychiatry and quote-unquote mind control.
So even though we've had that discussion about the kind of loaded term that brainwashing is, it's pretty impressive that a judge would then say, no, this is an important precedent to set for future cases. So again, it's another instance of the story of Steven Stayner having huge ripple effects beyond just one family's tragedy.
Right. The second legal question that has to be dealt with is whether or not to let Timothy White testify. Ellery knows the impact Timothy's testimony had during the trial during his own trial. So he believes that it would be extremely prejudicial to put him on the stand. And in this case, particularly because Timothy doesn't have anything to do with Steven's kidnapping. And to highlight this, you should know that LA Times, for instance, in an article about the legal issues, calls Timothy a, quote, angelic blonde youngster. So there's still this idea out there that he's a dangerous witness.
To me, though, it does have to do with the case because it's all the way. This is why Steven is out here, because he decided to take Timothy home. So I think it still does have a lot to do with this case.
And that's what the prosecution will say, that Timothy, he's there while Steven is also kidnapped. His presence basically ends the kidnapping, and you need to understand and see Timothy and hear him to understand how someone could break through to Steven. But that's an important part of this case.
Also, I think it's interesting too. I don't know. I can see why his defense wouldn't want that image up there, because it's Steven all over again. I mean, the exact kidnapping wasn't the same, but it's a good reference point for people that are, like you had mentioned earlier, that are having a hard time visualizing this 15, 16-year-old boy as a scared little kid in the back of a car. But we have an actual scared little kid. I mean, and Timothy wasn't on the witness stand, was amazing.
Right. But no, I think that's part of what the prosecution wants as well. You can actually see him sitting there, and this is what Steven would have been like.
And Timothy was kidnapped at 5, but this is further, so it is more Steven's age when he was kidnapped now.
Right.
So the jury could really see this is the age.
Yeah.
The judge actually rules with the defense and decides not to allow Timothy to testify. And since I've included Parnell's defense and sort of what he'll be talking about, I'll note here that Murphy's defense is both similar and different. His main defense is to attack the conspiracy charge. To do this, he'll say that he didn't plan to go to Merced on the day Steven went missing to kidnap someone, so that addresses sort of them working together. Second, his role in the kidnapping ended fairly quickly, so they're going to be focusing on that and convincing a jury that he's not as responsible as Parnell is. Murphy's lawyer will also make the argument that the statute of limitations for his role ended and the 3 years has lapsed, so they can't charge him. The prosecution disagrees. They feel there's plenty of evidence Murphy knew what they were doing that day and, in fact, helped Parnell in trying to kidnap other children. Halford also says that despite Murphy not seeing Parnell or Steven through the years, that his initial role leads to someone being in a state of kidnap for 7 years, and that role can't be separated. Not to mention Murphy, we haven't really talked about this, but Murphy knew he was helping someone to kidnap someone that they were going to raise and keep. And so he understands what he was going to do. That's the prosecution's ultimate idea.
It's not like he's pleading like, I didn't know what we were doing at the time.
He will try to plead that, and we'll go over it when we talk about, because he will testify, so we'll talk about his testimony, but he will say that he wasn't aware, because they have to attack both the charge of kidnapping and the conspiracy charge. So he will say that he wasn't aware that was what was happening that day. Which,
again, all centers around the idea of, did the kidnapping occur 7 years ago and end 7 years ago, or are we in I like the term, in a state of kidnap?
Right. On December 10th, 1981, trial starts with opening statements. After each side had spoken, the judge recessed the trial and addressed the Alameda County sheriffs. It seems that once again, Murphy was in court and had broken glasses. And the judge really, according to the papers, he's just had it by this point. He's very angry because he told them to do something. And when a judge tells you to do something, you should do it. So he stops court in the middle of court, and he is very angry. He calls in both the sheriff and I think the person who runs the Department of Health Services and chews them out and says, get him a pair of glasses. And then if they don't, he'll be starting to put people in jail.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because on the surface you're like, well, I mean, who cares? It's a pair of broken glasses. But I would imagine from the judge's perspective, any instance of impropriety is ammunition that somebody like this could use in a later court or a later case to get off of their charges, or say, well, I didn't have a fair trial because I was prejudiced, or the jury was prejudiced against me because of the way I looked.
Right. And according to the articles, he stops court himself. So this is not even something the defense brings up. This is something he sees and it's not fixed. And so he stops it himself, which just to me seems like a pretty good judge and a really good thing to do.
Also, it's not treating a defendant according to the way they should be treated according to the law.
Right. After that's dealt with, trial resumes, and the first two people to testify are Kay and Delbert Stayner. They describe the day Steven went missing. On December 14th, 1981, Steven Stayner will begin his testimony, and it will last 2 days. In California, there are protections in particular for children who testify in a criminal proceeding regarding sexual abuse. Testifying can be a difficult and traumatizing experience. Things like having a support person or an item that can comfort the child while they testify, like a doll or a bear. And even support animals are allowed in court to help children get through the process. In California, a judge can also rule to let a child, again, specifically only in sexual exploitation cases, testify on closed captioning. And there are several things that the judge takes into consideration before doing so, because a defendant does have the right to face their accuser, so it's not an automatic thing. There are victim services in several counties, both in Merced and in Mendocino, since we've been talking about those two counties, and at the state level who can help you, or someone you know navigate the system and all the things that you have access to. We'll make sure to put those up on our social media as well as our site. There are phone numbers for advocates. They can answer your questions and hopefully help you or someone you know through the process. On RAIN's website, which I can't say enough is an important site to go look at, there are some ideas for things to help when you or someone you know has to testify. We will link these on our site as well because they might really help. Several ideas like finding a place in the courthouse somewhere quiet that you can go and take a deep breath, packing water and food, because as we know, just in this case, there's lots of times where it takes all day or where you go all the way there and it gets canceled and you have to come back. So having a book or something to keep your mind busy. And there are even some tips for dealing with social media. It's a really great site for anyone who might be going through this or if you know someone. So we will definitely link all those. Steven's testimony will be difficult for him, and the newspapers describe him as looking more uncomfortable than the prior trial. He tried not to look over at Parnell when he was on the stand. He's a lot more fidgety, and he was already pretty upset in the last trial, according to the newspapers. He's moving a lot. He's back and forth. He's in a swivel chair. For most of his testimony, he faced the chair towards the jury, so not to have to look at Parnell. He does look over a couple of times. He spoke in really low tones.
With this one, though, last trial, he didn't get into his life.
Right.
This one, he has to, and it's probably showing a lot. No one wants to, especially with all these people in the court, the press is in there, people you don't know, and you have to tell these intimate details that are horrible to everyone. Just from swiveling in his chair a couple times, that's pretty brave, not doing, if he wasn't reacting more.
And I think courtrooms are just intimidating anyway, even if you're not going to have to testify about something really private. I mean, you have a judge, and I've been in a courtroom as a juror, and I was the whole time, I'm not the person who did anything wrong. I was really anxious.
This is also another instance of, for so much what we've talked about, there has been speculation about what was done. There was stuff reported in the newspaper, but none of it coming directly from Steven. And so now having to confront all of this from Steven's own, and it's going to be reported in the newspaper, and everything is made public, and it's now taken as gospel. That I can't, like you said, John, the bravery is amazing.
And he might be able to actually, none of it's been his story. This is his time. Right. It's the one instance of him taking control, I guess, in a certain sort of way. He's taking control of his own story. Yeah.
It's from his mouth. It's, even though it's 7 years of hell, he gets his time to say it.
It's difficult, though, because a lot of the research I was looking at was talking about how victims are talked to when asked questions when they're on the stand. And a lot of time they just are asked questions that are yes or no. They don't really get to stop and explain things. And because it's so difficult on the stand, it's hard to explain emotions.
Yeah.
You can get mixed up and in ways you don't intend to, and in ways that don't prove that you are lying, but it can sound that way. The whole testifying experience is...
Well, true. I mean, even when you described him on the stand, fidgeting, I know a lot of times that can be seen as somebody who's not necessarily truthful. So if I was a juror in a jury box, and I might be a little on the fence about this whole story, and then seeing a kid kind of, swaying back and forth or being fidgety or not being direct and not looking, I might tend to think, well, maybe there's something to this whole thing. There's not, and that's a terrible way to look at it, but...
The other thing is that this is a trial that's entirely on Steven's shoulders. There isn't a lot of physical evidence that will be brought forth, both dealing with the sexual abuse and just in general with the kidnapping. So this is really his testimony is the evidence.
If you don't believe Steven, then there's nothing that...
And that's a lot of pressure to put on anyone. Steven's testimony begins with the day he was kidnapped. He also talked about being threatened by Parnell with spankings if he ever talked about his past with anyone. When asked who stopped him in the street the day he was kidnapped, he inadvertently pointed at Parnell instead of Murphy. People in the court were surprised. The prosecution gives him a chance to correct himself, but this is just an example of an instance where he's just under a lot of pressure and he's trying to answer questions. The prosecution also asked questions about Steven's life throughout the 7 years, and he's asked to confirm that during different phases he did want to go home. He's also asked to elaborate that his time with Parnell wasn't happy, and he's asked to explain why he didn't leave. He talks about believing Parnell when he told him a judge gave him custody. And this is a really difficult thing to explain because there's a lot of factors involved here. He was a kid when he was kidnapped, and he both believes the lies that Parnell gave him, but also questioned him throughout the years, and experienced abuse and other things psychologically that kept him there. So it's a lot of things to explain for someone who's still processing their kidnapping. When pressed, he will say he doesn't know why he didn't leave. And Parnell's defense is that he did want to be there, so it's important to go over these things in detail.
And it's okay that he didn't understand why he stayed. He's a kid.
Right, of course.
And most of the adults in that courtroom wouldn't understand how the brain works or things about how trauma can affect an individual.
What makes an expert, like a psychologist or someone who deals with these things, that testimony really important, because it's their job to explain how that all works with Steven and to really get them to understand. And we've talked about that in some other cases. We talked about Onomima Nelson, where they had someone there to talk about domestic abuse, and it's their job to explain something that most people don't understand because they haven't gone through it.
Right.
Steven also tells the court he was told to call Irvin Murphy Uncle Murphy. On the stand, he also had to confirm the specifics of the abuse he suffered. We will not give those details, but the prosecution is trying to establish his treatment as well as the control Parnell held over him. Steven also says he grew up thinking sexual abuse was normal. When Steven is cross-examined, the defense uses a technique we've not talked about too much in other cases, but one we've probably all heard of: blaming the victim. Victim blaming is certainly a concept I've heard of, especially in cases of sexual assault, molestation, or rape. And despite those not being charges here against Parnell, as I said, they do become the focal point. In an article in The Atlantic called The Psychology of Victim Blaming from 2016, Professor of Social Work Barbara Gillen explains that victim blaming is actually applied to crimes all across the board. One of the reasons this is a default is because of the just world hypothesis. The basic idea being that people have a difficult time accepting that they live in a world of chaos. Humans like the idea that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. It's uncomfortable to think that crimes can happen for no reason and to anyone at any time. It helps us to believe there are things we can control that keep us safe. When we hear about crimes, rapes, murders, robberies, we tend to think about those things that the victim did that might have brought on these crimes. And we don't always do this because people are awful. Often it's because we want to learn to protect ourselves. There are lots of programs dedicated to helping people learn self-defense or how to carry your keys to protect you at all times. And on their face, their purposes of this isn't to victim blame, but it does suggest that if you act a certain way, you won't fall victim to a crime. And when we view the world through this lens, victims play a role in the things that happen to them. This is made worse when we add our biases and beliefs about certain kinds of people using race, gender, economic status, even age. And we'd hope we wouldn't see it in a trial like this one, that from the outside would seem like a slam dunk. A stranger kidnapped Steven Stayner off the street and then abused him for 7 years. But already in the first trial Steven testified in the Timothy White trial, we saw a glimpse of blaming him for his own crime. The defense in that case, if you remember, asked many questions about what the motives were for bringing Timothy in, alluding that Steven may have only done so because of the money. And his motive, no matter what it was, doesn't actually change the crime that occurred or who committed it. But things like that cause us to blame the victim and can have the effect of changing how we see and think about a crime. And this can happen with the jury. And if we think about how few cases are actually prosecuted in a courtroom, as we talked about before last episode, this is just a daunting thing for a lot of victims to have to overcome. On the stand, Ellery tries to undercut Steven as a reliable witness. And to do this, he asks Steven about every mistake or trouble he ever got into. Describing his life like that of Tom Sawyer, Ellery paints Steven as a boy who lived a happy life with no rules, who often got into trouble and spent much of his time hitchhiking. Specifically, Ellery questions Steven about the other types of kids he spent time with, many of them older. He's also asked to explain his role in a fight at school during a basketball game, as well as his use of alcohol and marijuana, the time he and a friend shot a window out at school with a BB gun, and when the friend threatened to tell, Steven shot him in the butt. He had to explain his use of cigarettes and that he had been detained by police once during a minor shoplifting incident when he went to a candy store during school hours. And I think it sounded like this was elementary school, so he was pretty little. We also find out he helped another kid use a Volkswagen Baja Bug to mess up the grass at Mendocino High School. And the point of all of this is just to discredit him as a witness and give the impression that he's a troubled kid who's responsible for some of the burden of both his kidnapping, and despite the fact that Parnell isn't charged with his molestation or rape, that he's also responsible for his own sexual assault. The newspaper describes everything that Ellery brings up as basically common for a kid. They're kind of, it seems, I mean, they're just telling the story, but it does give the context that they're a little surprised that this would be something you could use to discredit a kid and have thrown in your face. And it also seems to me, I mean, a lot of these things happen, well, a lot of them are just normal kid stuff, but also the liquor and drugs. I mean, Parnell didn't have any rules. He's not taking care of Steven properly.
Right. I mean, he probably provided them for him. And,
right.
I mean, Steven can't just go buy liquor and cigarettes when he's like 10. So someone had to give them to him.
And we know he gave them to other kids or sold them.
Right.
This line of questioning also does something else. It reminds the jury that Steven is older, and age shouldn't matter, but he's almost an adult, and after the age of 14, both the law and how people think about kids change. And the last thing the defense wants the jury to do is think about Steven as a 7-year-old who was kidnapped. Ellery is also trying to prove that the kidnapping ended years prior to the arrest of Parnell. To do this, he has to prove that Parnell no longer held any power over Steven. That force he used to kidnap him had gone away, and Steven chose to stay. And when a juror looks at the young man who sits in the jury box, now it might be harder to understand why he wouldn't have left.
It really doesn't seem like it should be up to Steven. With the very first lie of saying that he was adopted, it's not Steven's job to run away from his so-called adopter. None of this should matter at all. It shouldn't really have even been let in.
It's so frustrating. So to try and make jurors believe that Steven could have left and instead chose to stay, he questioned Steven about his life with Parnell. And despite this just being a year after Steven escaped, he's still processing when he's found from that first moment to even now, and probably for the rest of his life. And it's hard, I would imagine, difficult to explain to a jury. You're a kid, you're still trying to figure this all out yourself, and now you have to explain to a jury accurately why you would have stayed. Steven is asked to answer questions about his life. As we've talked about many times, there was much of Steven's life that was normal, and this is what he shares during the trial. Ellery also asked Steven about gifts and treatment. The word spoiled is used. And this really falls right in stereotypes about victims and a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the early episodes when we talked about people manipulating kids and doing that with presents and gaining their trust. And then to have that thrown into a child's face who's been hurt, it really made me angry. And this has to play also into the emotions any victim, but Steven is feeling the guilt that he feels when he shouldn't have to feel guilt, but he's on the stand and they're using all the things that are in your head kind of against you. Steven tells the court that in many ways he was spoiled. He was given his dog, Queenie, and over the years he was given bikes, sports equipment, toys, and books, things that a father would provide a son. He also talks about being happy much of the time he was gone. He went to places like Candlestick for a Giants game, the San Francisco Zoo, and Great America, and he's talking about all this on the stand during this trial.
This is during Ellery's cross-examination?
Right. Ellery goes hard at Steven's motives for bringing Timothy White home to Ukiah. He asks a series of questions meant to get at the heart of why Steven didn't just leave if he wanted to. At heart here is the idea that Steven is with Parnell because he chooses to be. He is asked a series of questions about people he knew, friends he had, schools he went to, and basically all of the opportunities he had to tell someone he was kidnapped or was suffering abuse and didn't. And I know we talked about being worried for Steven and for victims about having the specifics of their abuse out there that come out during trial that they're asked about. But this part here where an adult in a courtroom is alluding to the fact that Steven would choose this. This is the part that would worry me the most, I think, because it feeds into that idea that you wanted to be there and you wanted the things that happened to you to happen to you.
That you were to blame as the victim.
Right.
But again, a 7-year-old being taken far away from, I mean, even going from Merced to Cathay's Valley, that's, how's a 7-year-old going to get home?
Right. all of this is hard to listen to because it doesn't really make any sense. It seems clear what happened here, and yet on the stand for 2 days, for hours, he has to basically almost defend himself.
From the person who kidnapped and raped him.
Right. When asked why he didn't tell someone on one of his school trips or away games, Barbara Mathias even, or a teacher, friends during sleepovers, or why he kept coming home at all, he would say he didn't know.
This is just frustrating also because, for one thing, why would you want to tell, from the stories that Parnell told him, why would you want to say, hey, my parents gave me up because they couldn't afford me and this guy adopted me? I mean, it's not a story that I would tell anyone if my parents didn't care. On top of which, the amount of abuse that all those questions would get dragged up too, you know? And the idea of bringing Barbara Mathias, like, why would you not tell Barbara Mathias? Because she was abusing him as well.
I don't think at this time, we know he's been abused by Barbara Mathias, but at this time, the psychologist hasn't testified yet. And that's who I think first kind of tells the world what Steven has told him in confidence. So, but that doesn't change the fact that Steven knows that happened. And he's being asked on the stand, hey, why didn't you tell this lady about it? And that has to just be...
Because she's part of the problem too. So he's not going to tell her anything.
Right.
No, and it's another instance of another adult. I mean, at this point, I would imagine, having a warped sense of who to trust and who not to trust. And you don't know who's going to take your side. And we've talked a lot about the idea that adults are going to tend to side with other adults, you know, and
it seems like how Steven has acted through his life, he doesn't trust anyone.
Yeah.
And rightly so.
Right.
I mean, we've talked about it, and I know, Jessica, you've brought up a lot, that idea of a coping mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, he has developed his own survival techniques that have allowed him to survive in this horrible, horrible situation. And now when he's coming back to some reality, he's being drug out. All of the stuff is being drug out in the open again.
Yeah. And his experience and all the thing, not leaving. I mean, we've learned through research that's, you know, it's not uncommon. It's a pretty common thing to have happen. But I think Ellery is hoping for that one person in the jury who's going to side with him and say, yeah, why didn't he leave? And certainly we've run into those people.
Well, I think it's funny too, because we've talked about it. The idea that, well, why didn't you leave? He, even in his story with Timothy White, walking down a road with people passing by, he's a 14-year-old. How is he going to get home? I mean, like, no driver's license, no money. He lives out in the middle of nowhere. And granted, yeah, he was used to hitchhiking and moving around in places like this, but it's not conceivable to blame a child. And I think you said it, Sean, the idea that you're blaming him for not running away.
Right.
For the crime.
For the crime.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, podcast listener. This is Steven, the host of Trace Evidence, a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and missing persons. Each week, I dig deep into the evidence, suspects, and theories revolving around the unsolved cases you think you know: Elisa Lam, Aisha Degree, Brandon Lawson, and the ones you've never heard: Lily Aramburo, Candace Hilt, Kanika Powell. If you're a true crime fan, haunted by unanswered questions, join me each Monday for a thorough examination of the victims, their stories, and the unknown perpetrators behind them. Trace Evidence is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, and all your favorite podcatchers. Visit trace-evidence.com for a full list of episodes, transcripts, and to subscribe today.
In the Timothy White trial, Steven would be asked why he brought Timothy in, and he gives the reason that he's given all along. Lestrange, Parnell's lawyer in that trial, tried to suggest that he might have done it for the reward money. And in this trial, Ellery will ask questions that allude to another idea: that Steven became unhappy with the move to Manchester. Ellery believes Steven was angry with Parnell because he had moved them from Point Arena, where Steven had friends and was in school, to the middle of nowhere in a cabin without the plumbing, electricity, and where he was unable to see his friends and continue playing sports. He brings up Steven's attempt to stay in school by hitchhiking every day.
What is the point? Like, I understand all that, but this whole fabricated story that he was just mad, he still kidnapped him, and everyone knows that. So this story just seems so ridiculous.
I think he's trying to draw a distinction because he's trying to prove that Parnell didn't have the power over him that he did when he was younger. So if Steven could leave and bring Timothy in, or if Steven could leave because he's angry, then Steven, the rest of the time, has chosen to be there.
So he just makes up hypothetical situation A, B, C to try to prove.
Trying to get back to the idea that, for the argument that the kidnapping was a one-time event that happened 7 years before, and the fact that Steven remained there the whole way, well, then you can't make that argument anymore because, look, he left to bring Steven, and he left to do hitchhiking.
It's kind of a pathetic story that he tries to bring up to prove that.
Well, and that idea that you need reasonable doubt, you need one or two people on that jury to start that. Well, maybe he's right.
Yeah,
just that simple thing could open the door to more, more people thinking that way.
To drive this point home, Ellery asks Steven if the two hadn't moved to Mendocino Cabin, does Steven think he would have actually have left? And Steven shrugs that he doesn't. I mean, he doesn't know what would have happened if they hadn't made that move.
Right.
Stevens also asked about Murphy. He confirms for the court that Murphy never hurt him physically. I mean, other than kidnapping and force-feeding him sleeping pills. He does say there were times he suffered spankings from Parnell. He was also hit with a belt for playing with matches and once hit with a broomstick. They bring in some of Steven's teachers. They testify to the kind of student he was. His fourth grade teacher describes him as a shy loner who she worked with to get him to have a more lovable, endearing aspect. That's how she described it. She said by the end of the year, he was doing better. It bothered me at first when I read that they brought teachers in and the descriptions of him as a young kid kind of being shy and withdrawn, because just that all along has bothered me, that description of him. It feels like he's still on trial. But then I thought maybe they were trying to prove that the 7-year-old, the kind of outgoing 7-year-old who existed before, after the kidnapping, was different. And one of the main people on the stand is Steven's girlfriend from when he lived in Mendocino County. She testifies that her and Steven were at a party once, and Steven got drunk and very sad. He began to cry and told her he wanted to go home. She, thinking he was talking about going to his home in Mendocino, I mean, she didn't know he was kidnapped.
Right.
So she said she would take him home, to which he replied, "No, I mean my real home." She didn't know what he was talking about and didn't ask any follow-up questions, and it doesn't sound like it even occurred to her that he was talking about a kidnap or anything like that. But the defense is hoping this testimony will undercut Steven's testimony that he never told anyone and sort of paint him as a liar.
Again, you're victim blaming a kid who is out of his mind, I would imagine, who's drunk at a party. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I have not been kidnapped, but I've said some pretty weird stuff drunk. So
well, also, I mean, I won't say ideally, but like the alcohol, lowers your inhibitions. It sometimes makes you. So here's a kid who's had to guard everything he said to the public for years because of a fear of reprisals from Parnell, and in a moment, not thinking, lets it slip out to somebody who he really trusts. And the poor girl being put in that situation of like, I don't know what you're talking, and then now, years later.
Yeah. A psychologist named Dr. Philip Ham from Sacramento also testifies. He interviewed Steven 4 separate times, and the prosecutor wants to help jurors understand what Steven was going through and why someone in his position wouldn't come forward. This, as we said earlier, is new testimony. It's not usually done in courts at the time. According to the prosecution, Dr. Ham is an expert in dealing with children who've been through things like abandonment, being taken or kidnapped from their parents, and or children who identify with their aggressor. As covered by the San Francisco Examiner, Dr. Ham will tell the court that Steven suffered what some people might call brainwashing or mind control, but what he believes is more accurately called psychological influence. According to him, when Steven was taken and told that his parents had essentially abandoned him, he experienced shock and a compression of his universe. His reality shifted and changed. When this happened, he withdrew, eventually giving up and eventually identifying with Parnell, either through belief or resignation. His only decision was to take on the role of Dennis Parnell. It was a survival technique.
So that means that once that kidnapping occurs and he's in a state of kidnapping, he goes with Parnell, then his coping mechanism is that old life is dead to me. All I have in my world is what's directly in front of me. And that's how I'm going to go. I'm just going to get through life one step at a time within this small microcosm of my abuser and whatever situation we find ourselves in.
One thing this reminds me of is during the 30s when the WPA hired people to interview others who were former slaves, they found that besides just like the atrocities of the physical abuse, no hope was one of the big things that really was horrible. And this kind of reminds me of it. Steven is just kind of living through it because he has no hope. He doesn't know what to do.
Yeah, he's just surviving.
Right.
And I do think it's a hard thing to describe. We've tried to, throughout these episodes, describe the situation he's in where he's a little kid and told something he both believes, but there does seem to be a part of him that doesn't quite, always kind of wonders about it. But at the same time, when you take a kid and you tell them something, I mean, that child isn't supposed to be expected to challenge that. I mean, if you took a baby and then lied to it, it wouldn't be the baby's fault because it believed what you told them. And
Right.
I think that's true here, despite the fact that he also wondered over the years what happened to the Stayners and his other family, and especially after Timothy White is taken, that maybe he might have been in the same situation.
Yeah, and then on top of which or Parnell plies Steven with drugs and alcohol.
Right.
And continually is abusing him and forcing him further and further down this terrible spiral. To where even if he did start to question things, he's stuck in this loop of this is my new normal. This is my reality now.
Just get through it.
Right.
Yeah.
I just move forward.
Dr. Ham also used a series of tests to describe Steven, including a Rorschach test. These tests showed Steven was depressed and felt stepped on. Dr. Ham also describes the abuse he suffered and the ways in which it made Steven feel. He described a child who was repulsed and disgusted and was in both emotional and physical pain. He also was the person who tells the court about the abuse Steven says he suffered from Barbara Mathias. Dr. Ham's testimony is very important to the prosecution's case. They need the jury, as we've been talking about, to understand that even though Parnell wasn't holding Steven in a locked room or at gunpoint, he was applying a force to him.
On top of which, this is the first time that Barbara Mathias' name is brought up in public in relation to the abuse. That
I'm aware of. I didn't see it anywhere else.
And this is after she came to their house to visit. I can't imagine
Right, yeah.
that the Stayners sitting in courtroom and hearing that and then realizing that you were sitting 5 feet away from somebody that abused your son.
And giving like tea and snacks or whatever she did.
Yeah, it's
And
just
then
disgusting.
Having her say that, oh, don't worry, he was a good boy. He called me mom.
Yeah, but it follows a lot of the manipulations
Right.
we've talked about. Other testimony includes Ukiah police officer Ira Warner. He's not someone I saw come up in any earlier articles, but he says something that is closest to what is said, I think, in the movie. He says Steven said when he was there at the police station, quote, "My name is Steven Stayner, and I've been missing from Merced for 7 years." It's the first time I see that come up, and he isn't someone who's interviewed in earlier articles. He also said Steven spelled his last name incorrectly when he gave it to police. He spelled it as Stainner.
Which would fit.
Yeah, he was little when he was
a
taken.
7-year-old, and he hasn't used that name for most of his life at this point.
And weird fact, a lot of the newspapers misspell the Stayner name during this time.
Oh, really?
It's spelled in really weird ways. I don't know. He also tells the court that Steven only gives police Parnell's name after they convince him to, by saying that Parnell was sick and needed help. This is really evidence that even though Steven brought Timothy in, he hasn't entirely broken through the force of control of Parnell, and probably for a couple of reasons. As we've discussed, he thinks of him as family. Barbara Mathias also testifies. I don't know if I don't think it comes after the psychologist. I think it's before. The newspaper made it sound as if she was a bit of an uncooperative witness. During her testimony, she called herself a live-in babysitter and denied having any kind of romantic relationship with Parnell. She does tell the court that when they all lived together, Steven and Parnell slept in the back of the bus in a room, and she slept in the front. This, I believe, the prosecution hopes will lend credibility to Steven's story. The last thing the prosecution presents is a recording of the interview they had the night that Murphy was arrested. They play it for the jury, and what we learn about Murphy is that he dropped out of school in the 6th grade in part because he was a slow learner. He trained at Job Corp as a janitor for 3 weeks in Pleasanton, California, just a few minutes from where the trial is now, before getting a job as a janitor in Yosemite Valley. Murphy tells the police that Parnell's plan was to get a child and keep him until he was 21 years old, and then tell him about his real mother and father. On the tape, he also says that Parnell had told him he was a minister of God, and Murphy knew he wasn't affiliated with any particular church or had any education as a minister, but he believed him. Murphy also talks about being lonely. After the pair kidnapped Steven, Murphy did suggest to Parnell that they call the parents. Parnell told him no. It also appears that at some point Parnell started to threaten Murphy before he left for Santa Rosa. And after Parnell was in Santa Rosa, he did call Murphy at least once to threaten him. It seems that while Murphy and Parnell were working together, the two had opened a joint checking account into which Murphy was depositing money. After Parnell left Yosemite with Steven, Murphy continued depositing a certain amount of his monthly paycheck for about 4 months. After this last payment, Murphy hears from Parnell and then never hears from him again.
It's really strange that Murphy suggests that they call the parents. That's just, you just kidnapped a child. Hey, we should call the parents and tell them what? Like, that's a weird suggestion.
Yeah, I don't know what he was thinking, or if he thinks this plot is whatever Parnell has told him is real and they're okay to take a child. I don't know.
Yeah.
On the tape, Murphy also talks about seeing the news coverage of Steven and Timothy White. He said that he was shocked that Parnell had taken another child and felt betrayed. He also began to wonder how many other children Parnell might have hurt or taken. After the tape is played, the prosecution rests, and Murphy takes the stand in his own defense. His attorneys want to prove that he was duped by Parnell, and Murphy testifies that he didn't realize what Parnell was doing was a crime. His attorneys also need to address the conspiracy charges. Murphy testifies under oath that he didn't know they went to Merced the day Steven was kidnapped to actually kidnap a child. He said he believed they were just going to get some things they needed in Yosemite and to Christmas shop. Murphy also testifies that Steven wasn't upset to be with the men. He says he never saw him cry and that he thought he was enjoying himself and playing with the toys. The one time Murphy did see Steven get a little upset, he believed it was because he was bored with the toys and not happy with the dinner they had. When the Merced district attorney cross-examines Murphy, he has to be really careful how he talks to him. Murphy does not appear on the stand to be very formidable, and the newspapers talk about him much differently than they do Parnell. He's the guy people seem to easily feel for. So Halford is afraid that if he attacks Murphy's testimony too hard, instead of hearing his actual answers, the jury will feel badly for him and make their decision on that and not the facts. But it's Halford's job to prove Murphy knew what he was doing and had been planning to kidnap a child with Parnell. During his questioning, Murphy becomes confused and has a difficult time answering questions. Most of his answers contradict what he testified previously. Under questioning, Murphy had trouble explaining why his answers on the tape he gave the night he was arrested were so different than the ones he gave in court. He also admitted he knew it was wrong that when they kidnapped Steven, and that he didn't know why he helped Parnell. He talked about the planning of the kidnapping and that they tried to take at least 2 other boys earlier the day that they kidnapped Steven. When asked what he thought over the years, he said he didn't think about it and pushed it to the back of his mind. After Parnell and Steven left for Santa Rosa, Murphy began to drink heavily. When he thought about the Stayner family, he considered calling the police and even picked up the phone once and dialed the number to the Merced Police Department, but quickly hung up. He was afraid of what would happen if he turned himself in. He also said that he hoped Steven could forgive him.
It's pretty interesting how it's kind of backwards. They're like railing Steven, who's still a minor. And then when it comes to Murphy, who's a full-grown man, they have to treat him like a child that he doesn't, ball up and not give answers. It's kind of weird.
When pressed on the stand as to why he kidnapped Steven, the San Francisco Examiner has his quote as, "I don't have no excuse. Those excuses I told them then, that's all they were, just excuses." Parnell's defense has a different tactic. It's mainly to attack Steven and his motives. And now that they're ready to present their case, they don't actually call anyone to the stand. So they're just hoping the jury will side with them. Parnell wants to take the stand in his own defense, but his lawyer talks him out of that. Closing arguments begin, and Murphy's attorneys urge the jury to find him guilty of a lesser offense of false imprisonment, since his role in the kidnapping ended quickly after it happened. Parnell's defense argues the same thing they have during trial, basically blaming Steven for the situation he's in. They state that Steven got into the car by choice and was never physically abused. In his closing statement, Ellery also uses something that lasts long after this case, is often talked about in many articles and TV shows, and something that will be picked up and used by Steven's brother Kerry during his trial. Ellery talks at length about how Steven wanted to be with Parnell and only brought Timothy White in for selfish reasons, and has enjoyed the media coverage and attention he's received. A big part of his entire argument at the end is all about Steven and the attention he's gotten from the media. And I'll quote part of his argument from the Auburn Journal on January 5th, 1982. Quote, "Consider the Steven Stayner you saw by the forces influencing him at the time. There was extensive coverage of Steven Stayner, and he said he enjoyed being portrayed on television screens and in newspaper pages. That same coverage that he has enjoyed included making Kenneth Eugene Parnell an outcast." Ellery goes on to say that Steven, quote, "perpetuated the negative image of the man he called Daddy in order to build himself up." Ellery also referred to Steven as abnormal and used the testimony given by the psychiatrist and psychologist against him. Quote, "Psychologists testified he has a character disorder. Is that disorder evidence of force, or is it evidence he has two personalities, two sets of values which he must unify?" And I've run into this idea before, most often in reference to Kerry. And this is defense Kerry's attorneys will use, and it's just always bothered me to see people pick this argument up directly from someone's defense and without much evidence use it as truth. But now I know this defense originates as a defense for Parnell, and I don't think when people use this or talk about it, they realize they're using an argument used by a rapist who hurts kids as an excuse for doing so.
It's crazy to think that, too, because I know just recently the 2020 spot and a few others that have run this is a common thread that's often used is Kerry one of the reasons why Kerry, or an explanation for Kerry's actions in the murders that he committed, was he was lashing out because of his brother got so much attention, but that's the only argument that they make. Parnell's defense has no witnesses, no evidence of any kind. It's all hearsay, and it all hinges on impugning Steven Stayner and vilifying him, that he's a spoiled kid who threw a tantrum and walked off.
It's so ridiculous that this is the defense. He's still kidnapped. And I understand what they're trying to, the whole 3 years, when did it start? But just bringing it all this garbage up that is just ridiculous
and no basis in fact.
Yeah,
I mean, if somebody came and said it was a piece of fiction, I don't think people would, it's one of those things that's truth is stranger than fiction. Nobody would believe this story. If I saw this in a movie, I'd be like, no, there's no way that would happen. There's no way that would happen, but it did.
Right. And to think that to me, that if I was a juror, to forget that he was technically kidnapped,
right,
just because he got to go to Great America and he didn't leave on his own, it's ridiculous.
Well, and you've mentioned this quite a bit, Jessica, is the idea that it's, in this case, it's tragic and terrible, but we do have to remember that this kind of argument is used in abuse cases and sexual assault cases today.
All the time.
That the victim is there to blame. She or he is responsible for the attack that happened to them because of what they wore, how they acted, or whatever else went on. That it wasn't really rape, or it wasn't really abuse. And that's also, something we need to take away from that is, this story is terrible, but it's terrible every time we hear it, not just when it happens to this child, but it's also it's terrible when we hear it when it's currently happening in news stories or newspaper articles or wherever you see it.
Merced's DA Halford also gives a closing argument. He says that it doesn't matter when it looks like Murphy's role ends, the conspiracy doesn't end legally until the crime itself does, and this crime doesn't end until Steven Stayner escapes. He also tries to remind the jury that the almost fully grown man that sits before them is not the person who was kidnapped. He was a child when this happened, when Parnell and Murphy made the decision to take him and put him under their control. And I think that bothers us. It bothers me because he's a kid, but I can understand having to remind the jury that he was even littler.
Especially in a case where there is some evidence, but not a lot of what we, like in 2019, would think of physical evidence. There's not,
right?
You don't have a smoking gun, so to speak.
It is really a he said kind of case,
right.
Even though that seems, I was not expecting when I researched to find that, because this seems like such a easily closed case. What's the problem here? It's
right.
so upfront. I can't even imagine in some of these cases that are more complicated than this.
Right.
After closing arguments, the jury gets the case, and the three main questions they have to ask themselves, according to the San Francisco Examiner, are: 1, was Steven Stayner forcibly detained, or did he, a boy between 7 and 14 years old, during the captivity, consent? Number 2, is psychological influence a kind of forcible detention? And 3, how does any of this affect the 3-year statute of limitation? And I think it's also important to remember that a lot of this psychological stuff is the first time many of these jurors will have heard it. In 2019, we've considered it. We're into true crime, so we've read a lot about it, but these are people who've never really been confronted with this, and it's not as common as it is now.
And we've said really from day one that this case is unique in a lot of ways. He was kidnapped. He wasn't found for 7 years. He rescues another boy. It's another instance in this entire story of something improbable happening that this jury has to contend with the idea of, is psychological force?
Right. Does this, and is a psychologist explaining it, does that make sense to me? And is it something I can rely on as a science?
I mean, in that respect, we're what, like 4 or 5 years past when being gay was taken out of the DSM. So it's a science that people are still arguing. I mean, people still arguing about psychologists and psychology today. So in 1980, I can imagine what that would be like in a courtroom.
Yeah, I imagine. I always think of the OJ trial when they're learning about DNA for the first time, because we were alive for that, and it seems so now we all accept that as just science. I don't even know if people could really explain it to you. It's so accepted, and I think the same sort of thing is happening here. They're having to explain
new
psychology basically,
right,
and how this would work, because nobody knows.
No, and being on that edge, the first time that you have to hear it, and a group of people that come from all different kinds of backgrounds that may not necessarily have all the same levels of knowledge or education
But it's why a witness, a person who knows what they're doing, is so important, because they really can get that through to them and change they can really see Steven's side in a way they wouldn't have before.
Right. And again, it's anybody on a jury, you hope would take it as seriously as these people seem to.
Of course, yeah. After 18 days of trial and 39 witnesses testifying, a jury of 6 men and 6 women let the judge know they've come to a decision after just a few hours. In court, Parnell is calm, and Murphy is clearly irritated and is chewing on his knuckles. When the judge reads the verdict, he finds the jury has found Parnell and Murphy guilty of different crimes. They found Parnell guilty of kidnapping and Murphy guilty of a lesser charge of false imprisonment. But this is a conspiracy trial, and whatever one is guilty of, the other has to be as well. So he has to send them back to deliberate. When the jury comes back, the judge reads the verdict, and both Parnell and Murphy are found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap Steven Stayner, the more serious offense. Court is adjourned while the judge considers sentencing. And we didn't really talk about this part in the Timothy White trial, but it can take months. I think 3 months go by before he comes back and is sentenced. Reporters talk with jurors and discover that they had a very difficult time coming not to a consensus, but an ultimate decision. They all wanted to charge Parnell with kidnapping, but many of them did not feel it was right that Murphy be charged with the same crime. They really felt like he was duped. I think Murphy is, as we said, both to the press and to, I think, the court, comes across much differently than Parnell. He's not as scary.
I can kind of see where they're coming from because, like we've spoke about before, he's kind of the child in this case, and they don't want to really ruin his life for some reason because they think he's the gentle young man, or even though he's old. But I think how he perceived himself and how he answered and everything like that, they just don't feel like he's anywhere close to Parnell.
Well, yeah, you're right. Because between Parnell's story of Hank and the defense of, I kidnapped Steven because he wanted to be kidnapped, and I kept him because he wanted to be kept, and there was no sexual abuse at all, I think that people really saw through his lies. And then with Murphy being Murphy, it was easier to grasp on that idea of like, no, Parnell's the one that's manipulating Murphy. Murphy is guilty, but he's guilty because Murphy or Parnell put him up to it. Had Parnell not been there, Murphy wouldn't have done anything. Not excusing what he did, because bottom line, he helped kidnap a child.
But I think that's another thing, how he came off on the stand when he said those were excuses. There's no excuses.
Yeah.
You know, he kind of, in a way, copped to it, you know, and so they don't feel like he's as bad as Parnell.
Yeah.
And the prosecution using the tapes of Murphy when he was arrested, you know, he cops to it pretty quick and gives a lot of detail about what went on and stuff. So it was never to me, it doesn't seem like the duplicity and the underhandedness that Parnell has, and the lying that Parnell has done since day one.
Yeah, he's a far more sympathetic character. When the judge convenes the court to give his decision, the Stayner family, and this is months later, the Stayner family does not come to court. After that last day when the verdict was reached, the Stayners tell the press that for them, that's it. They're done. They don't need to wait any longer. They're going to get back to their life, which makes a lot of sense.
I have a hard time with that one. I think just because I would want to see some comeuppance. I know nothing would ever satisfy me as punishment for Parnell, but I would want to see the sentencing.
I think it might be the difference between imagining what you might want and then, not to say that you wouldn't, and being there, and it's been years, and you've also lost 7 years with your kid, and now you're losing more years to trials. It's just time to move forward, and I think it's not an unhealthy thing to do. No,
it's amazing. And also that idea of justice in the bigger sense, like what can the court do that will ever make up for the hell Steven went through and his entire family? You're not going to get that back.
Maybe just saying that he did, like, everyone believes that he did it now is enough, instead of the sentencing at all.
Right. That idea of it's done. It's
and he's
public
not
record.
out right now. You know, he can't hurt somebody else. Once in the court, the judge gives his decision, and to a lot of people's surprise, the judge says that due to a quirk in the law, he can only give Parnell an extra 20 months of jail time. Here's the thing. Under the 1972 kidnapping law, which we talked about, it used indeterminate sentencing. The punishment for kidnapping can be 1 to 25 years. Under the current law in 1980, the one used in Timothy White's case, kidnapping can carry a penalty of 3, 5, or 7 years. The problem here is that Parnell is found guilty, but under the law, this is considered a second offense. And both the 1972 and the 1980 law have provisions that direct a judge to give less jail time for a second offense. And for a second offense, the law will only allow 1/3 of the median sentence to be added to the time served. In this case, the median sentence a judge will use is 5 years. All of that 5 years to serve concurrently with his years given to him during the last trial, and only 20 months can be added to his jail time. And this is where we talked about which trial would have been first would have really mattered, because if the trial of the kidnapping of Steven had come before the other one, then Parnell would have received 7 years in his case instead of the 20 months.
It's sad that it's that way. He would still probably get the same amount of time, correct?
Yeah, ultimately, yeah.
Yeah, but it's just like, for 16 days or 7 years, you would rather him get the longer sentence for the 7 years instead of 16.
Right. While handing down his decision, the judge himself is very upset about this part of the law. He doesn't think it's justice nor what Parnell deserves, but he doesn't have a choice. In fact, his only choice is to decide which law to sentence Parnell under, and he could have used the 1972 law or the 1980 law. He says that if he had used the 1972 law, he would have been forced to give Parnell even less time, so he uses the one that gives him more time. Murphy, on the other hand, is sentenced to the full 5 years, as this charge for kidnapping is a first offense. The judge also feels for Murphy, but in the end, he kidnapped a child, and no amount of feeling bad for him can change what decision that made on what the impact it had on Steven's life. So the other thing that's really difficult about this is when Parnell is found guilty months before, the papers interview the Stayners, they interview the jurors, and when they ask them what they hope Parnell receives in punishment, they all say the maximum, which they think is 25 years. So this verdict of 20 months comes as a complete surprise to everybody. I don't know how the lawyers knew about it. I would think they would have had to have known, but for the family who are at home when they get this news and they find out only 20 months when they're expecting a pretty hefty sentence.
And that doesn't seem very fair or I guess not fair, but it doesn't seem very ethical that if I'm a prosecutor and the victim is here, I would feel obligated to say, here's what can happen and explain to them what the law says so that not that you're going to fix it, but you try to mitigate those feelings as much as possible.
I didn't see any articles because I looked where the prosecutors or the defense were interviewed about this. So I don't know if they're taken by surprise. I can only imagine they weren't because they're lawyers, but so I can't say for sure, but all the people they interview, the families, just everyone else has no idea. So I don't know if it's a case where, like you're saying, they didn't tell them, there wasn't a lot of communication, or like now I don't know if big trials everything gets explained to you by someone on TV. So I don't know the situation here is, but it's hard to see this happen after they're expecting something else.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and happen to be a lawyer and know, do prosecutors, and I imagine the defense would, but do prosecutors talk to victims of serious crime and explain what can happen at sentencing, or is that just left up to the public record to then inform people? Please let us know. You can email us.
What I do know is during this time, there is a lot of stuff that isn't done with family. And there are a lot of law changes because of that. So I'm not saying that's what happened here. I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me because
of what the law says.
Some of those things protecting victims and families and setups where you get explained things. Jurors also talked to the press. They were very upset and felt cheated, as if all their efforts in the trial had been undone. I mean, why was everyone caring so much for nothing, in their opinion? Immediately, there are calls to change the law. In particular, Mendocino District Attorney Joe Allen fights to fix it and suggests specific changes. The judge hands down the sentence in February 1982, and by August of 1982, a bill is passed in California called the Bosco Bill, or AB 3477. It increases prison terms for cases where there are more than one kidnapping. Specifically, it will apply to kidnappings that involve different victims in different places, and the new sentences will not run concurrently. So instead of, if you get 5 years, then the next one you'd also get an added 5 years, so 10 years total.
And as upset as I imagine everyone is at this, I mean, the small ray of light at the cloud is the fact that now there's legislation to change that for future cases.
Yeah, and it happens quickly.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so you can't say that this wasn't directly responsible
for
this law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In 2019, the law for kidnapping in California is also different than in 1980. The kidnapping law in California now says, under Penal Code 207B, every person who, for the purpose of committing any act defined in Section 288, which is a section of law that defines and deals with molestation, hires, persuades, entices, decoys, or seduces by false promises, misrepresentations, or the like, any child under the age of 14 years to go out of this country, state, or county, or into another part of the same county is guilty of kidnapping. This act can carry with it a punishment of life in prison with the possibility of parole. But like this case, the question becomes not so much one of did it happen, but can you prove it? We'll end this episode here. We have 2 more episodes left in this series on the life and kidnapping of Steven Stayner. Next episode, we're going to tell you all about the rest of Parnell's life and talk about some of the laws that we discussed way back in episode 1 and how they've changed, and a few other laws actually change in the upcoming episodes because of this case. Do you guys have anything you want to add?
No, I know personally, I think my outrage just spoke for itself.
No, I'm tired after getting so mad at this episode.
And it's a hard one because of what you want. What you want is you want a happy ending. And I know that's not always the case in real life. And I'm happy that he was arrested. I'm happy that he was convicted, but it just seems such a slap in the face.
Well, I do think the one thing that we can be happy about, or not happy about, but look on the bright side of, I do think through all of this, through everything Steven had to go through, he definitely saved some other kids from having the same fate.
Yeah, and his heroic act of not just saving Timothy White, but also surviving, and then his example going on out to other people, and then the law that was changed.
Yeah, and his life will definitely change a lot of laws.
Those all have ripple effects that we're still feeling. So that's an amazing achievement. The information for this cold case comes from the Merced Sun-Star, the Modesto Bee, and the Merced Police Department's Facebook page. On October 1st, 2006, firefighters in Merced, California, were called to a house on fire on East South Bear Creek at 2:23 a.m. There they found a house on fire and the bodies of a married couple, Bill and Lena Chapman. Not much is publicly known about this crime as police are still investigating, but it is believed that the couple was being robbed, perhaps by multiple people, when they were murdered. A fire was set to destroy evidence. Bill was 91 years old, and his wife Lena was 81 years old at the time of their deaths. Since their murder, their 3 children and other family and friends have been searching for answers. Every year, they walk the streets of Merced, handing out flyers and telling their parents' stories. Bill and Lena Chapman were loving people who moved to Merced in 1953. Bill opened up Chapman's Shoes, a store that was a mainstay of the Merced business area. He retired in 1980. Lena was a mother who took care of the family's photo album by wrapping them twice in plastic bags, a gesture that saved the photos during the fire and water from the fire hoses. The Chapman's family and loved ones are looking for answers in this case, and a $75,000 reward has been set up for information leading to a conviction in the murder of Bill and Lena Chapman. If you have any information, no matter how small, call the Merced Police Department on their anonymous tip line at 209-385-4725.
We'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of California True Crime. You can reach us at our social media sites such as Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Cali True Crime. If you'd like to email us, you can email at calitruecrime@gmail.com. We also have a Patreon page if you'd like to help support us. We'd like to thank our spirit animal guide, Melanie Duncan. This has been a production of Chateau Walnut.